The first hard freeze of the season always came quietly. One night the ground was soft and damp, and the next morning the earth rang like iron beneath a boot. Frost crept across the fields and fences, turning every blade of grass white. The pond behind the cabin stiffened around the edges. Even the tall pines seemed to stand a little straighter in the cold. Winter in that valley was not gentle. It did not arrive politely and ask permission, it settled in and stayed. That was why the woman had begun digging long before the first snow. Anyone passing along the narrow trail that wound through the trees might have thought the small cabin was empty. It sat alone near the edge of the woods, built from rough logs, darkened by years of weather. Smoke rose from the chimney most evenings, thin and steady, but few people ever came close enough to knock on the door. The nearest town was half a day away by wagon. In summer the trip was slow but easy. In winter it could become impossible. Snow could bury the road in a single night. That meant one thing above all else. If you did not have dry firewood, you did not last the winter. The woman understood that better than most. She had learned it during her first cold season in the valley, a winter that nearly drove her from the place for good. The wood she stacked outside had frozen solid beneath heavy snow. Each log burned poorly, hissing and smoking instead of giving heat. Many nights she sat beside the weak fire wrapped in blankets, listening to the wind push against the cabin walls. She had promised herself that it would never happen again. So when the ground was still warm enough to dig, she began a project no one in town knew about. At first it looked like nothing more than a shallow pit beside the cabin. A few boards leaned nearby, and a pile of dirt slowly grew against the tree line. If anyone had seen her working there, they might have guessed she was fixing a cellar or setting a new post. But the woman worked mostly at dawn and in the quiet hours of evening. The forest kept her secret. She dug carefully, shaping the hole wide and deep enough to hold several stacks of split logs. When the earth was firm and square, she lined the sides with heavy timber. The wood fit together tight, each board cut and placed with patient hands. Above it all, she built a thick wooden lid that rested flat against the snow once winter came. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than a patch of ground beside the cabin. But beneath that lid sat a hidden woodshed, dry, protected, safe from snow and ice. It had taken weeks to finish, and more than once she had stood back to study the work with tired satisfaction. When the last board was set and the lid lowered into place, the earth around it looked untouched. Only someone who knew exactly where to look would notice the faint lines of the hidden door. By the time the first snowfall drifted through the valley, the secret woodshed was already filled with carefully stacked firewood. The woman cut the logs herself through the autumn. Each morning the steady sound of the axe echoed between the trees. Chip by chip the pile grew larger. She split every piece until the wood was dry and clean, perfect for burning. Then she carried it down into the hidden space beneath the ground. It was quiet work, hard work too, but it gave her a strange peace. Every log stacked below meant one more warm night when the storms came. And the storms would come. The first real snow arrived late one evening as she finished carrying the last armful of wood inside. The sky had been heavy all afternoon, the clouds hanging low over the forest. By nightfall thick flakes drifted through the air, slow and silent. She stood on the cabin step for a moment watching them fall. Snow had a way of changing everything. The valley grew softer under its blanket. Sound traveled differently. Even the wind seemed to whisper rather than roar. By morning the ground was white. The hidden woodshed vanished completely beneath the snow. Only the woman knew it was there. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. Each morning she stepped outside with a small shovel, brushing snow away from the wooden lid. She lifted it carefully and climbed down into the narrow space below. The scent of dry wood filled the small chamber. She would choose several logs, pass them up through the opening, then close the lid once more. After a light sweep of snow across the top, the ground looked untouched again. Inside the cabin the fire burned bright. Warmth spread through the small room, chasing the winter chill from the walls. The stove crackled gently while wind drifted past the windows. Most evenings she sat beside the fire mending clothes or reading from an old book whose pages had long since yellowed. Sometimes coyotes called from the distant hills. Sometimes the forest was so quiet it felt like the world had paused. Weeks passed this way. Snow piled deeper around the cabin. The path to the woods disappeared. Branches sagged under heavy white weight, and the sky turned pale and cold above the valley. Still, the hidden woodshed held plenty of dry logs. The woman allowed herself a small smile each time she lifted the lid and looked down at the neatly stacked wood. Her plan had worked, or so she thought. One late afternoon, the wind shifted. Storm clouds rolled over the hills faster than usual, thick and dark. The air carried a sharp bite that warned of heavy weather ahead. She hurried outside to gather the day's firewood before the snow started. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Even the birds had gone silent. She brushed the snow aside from the hidden door and lifted the wooden lid. Cold air slipped up from the small chamber beneath her feet. She reached down for the top logs in the stack. That was when she noticed something strange. The pile did not look quite the same as it had that morning. At first she thought it was only her tired eyes. The light was fading quickly, and shadows gathered along the wooden walls of the hidden shed. But when she leaned closer, a small crease formed on her brow. One of the stacks had shifted. A few logs near the back were out of place. She was certain she had not touched that section. The woman froze, her hands still resting on the edge of the opening. For a long moment she listened. The wind moved through the trees above. Snow began tapping softly against the cabin roof. Somewhere far off a branch cracked under the weight of ice. Then, from the dark space beneath the ground, she heard a faint sound. It was small. Almost too soft to notice, but it was there. A slow movement against the stacked wood. And it was coming from inside the hidden woodshed. The woman held still, her hand resting on the rough wooden edge of the hidden door. The wind moved through the trees behind her, pushing loose snow across the yard, but the sound she had heard did not come from the forest. It came from beneath the ground. For a moment she told herself it was nothing more than a log settling against another. Wood shifted sometimes, especially when the air turned colder. She had seen it happen before in stacked piles outside the cabin, but this felt different. The sound had been slow, careful. She leaned slightly closer to the opening, her breath forming a thin cloud in the cold air. The small underground woodshed smelled just as it always had, dry timber and earth. The stacks of firewood still filled most of the narrow space. Nothing moved, she waited. The wind picked up again, pushing snow against the side of the cabin. The door creaked softly on its hinges. Somewhere in the woods a branch fell with a dull thud. The woman reached down and lifted 2 logs from the top of the nearest stack. The wood felt dry and solid in her hands, just the way she liked it. She set them beside the opening, then reached for another. As she did, her eyes moved once more toward the back of the small chamber. The shifted pile was still there. A few logs were angled differently than the neat pattern she always kept. One piece had rolled slightly forward. It rested against another stack where it did not belong. She knew every inch of that hidden shed. She had stacked each log herself during the long autumn weeks. Nothing inside should have changed. A quiet feeling of unease settled in her chest. She straightened slowly and looked around the yard. Snow had begun falling harder now, covering the ground in a smooth white layer. The woods stood dark and silent beyond the clearing. There were no footprints anywhere near the cabin. No sign that anyone had walked through the snow. The woman picked up the logs she had gathered and closed the heavy wooden lid. She brushed a thin layer of snow back over it until the hidden door blended into the ground again. Then she carried the firewood inside. The cabin welcomed her with a faint warmth from the stove. She placed the logs beside the hearth and stirred the coals until the flames rose again. The room filled with the familiar crackling sound of burning wood. Still, her thoughts kept drifting back to the woodshed beneath the ground. She had lived alone in the valley for several years now. The quiet never bothered her. In truth, she had chosen the place because of the quiet. But winter had a way of sharpening every sound. As evening settled over the forest, the wind grew stronger. Snow brushed against the windows and gathered along the doorframe. The fire inside the stove glowed steady and bright. The woman sat in her chair near the hearth, mending a tear in one of her wool gloves. Her hands worked slowly with the needle and thread, yet her mind wandered. She thought about the hidden woodshed again, and about the sound she had heard. The cabin creaked softly as the wind pressed against the logs. That was normal. The old wood shifted sometimes during storms. She had grown used to those noises. But this had been different, careful, almost like something moving on purpose. She set the glove down and listened. Nothing but the wind. After a while, she told herself the same thing she had told herself earlier. The wood had likely settled when the temperature dropped. That happened often when winter deepened. Logs could shift and press against one another as the air dried them further. It was a simple explanation. And yet the feeling in her chest did not fade. Later that night the storm thickened. Snow fell in heavy waves, and the wind began to howl through the tall pines. The cabin stood firm against it, the way it had for many winters before. A fire burned strong, filling the small room with steady warmth. The woman prepared a simple meal and ate near the stove. Afterward, she placed another log into the firebox and closed the iron door. Outside the world disappeared beneath snow. Inside the cabin, the light flickered gently along the wooden walls. She tried reading for a while, but the words on the page refused to hold her attention. Her thoughts kept circling back to the same place, the hidden woodshed, the shifted logs, the faint sound from the dark space beneath the ground. Before long, she set the book aside and stood. The storm was growing stronger, but the lid over the woodshed was thick and heavy. Snow might pile high over it by morning. If that happened, opening it later could take more effort. Perhaps it would be wise to bring in extra firewood tonight. The idea gave her a small reason to step outside again. She wrapped a heavy coat around her shoulders, pulled on her gloves, and opened the cabin door. Cold wind rushed in immediately, carrying a swirl of snowflakes into the room. The yard looked different already. Fresh snow covered everything in a smooth white blanket. The path she had walked earlier had vanished completely. The hidden woodshed lay somewhere beneath that layer, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The woman stepped carefully across the yard. Her boots pressed deep prints into the new snow as she reached the spot beside the cabin. She brushed the surface with her glove until the edge of the wooden lid appeared. Then she cleared the snow away. The wind tugged at her coat while she lifted the lid. The opening revealed the same narrow underground space. The stacked firewood waited in neat rows along the wooden walls. For a moment, everything looked normal. She knelt and reached down for a log. That was when she saw it. The shifted stack at the back had changed again. Two pieces now leaned slightly outward as if something had pressed against them from behind. The woman froze. A cold feeling moved slowly along her spine, and it had nothing to do with the winter air. She stared into the dim woodshed. The logs were still, nothing moved. She told herself that perhaps she had misremembered the stack earlier. It was possible she had placed those pieces that way herself during the autumn. After all, the work had taken many days. Still, she could not shake the feeling that something had been disturbed. Carefully, she picked up 2 more logs and passed them up to the ground beside the opening. Then she paused again. This time she leaned farther forward, peering deeper into the shadowed space. The small chamber did not leave much room to move. The stacks of firewood filled nearly every corner. Only a narrow strip of floor remained in the middle where she could step when gathering wood. And there, in that thin strip of packed earth, she noticed something she had not seen before, a faint mark. At first it looked like nothing more than a shallow line in the dirt floor. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she realized the line curved slightly. Another mark crossed beside it, forming a small pattern in the dust. The woman felt her breath catch. Those marks had not been there earlier in the winter. She was certain of it. The floor had been smooth when she first stacked the wood. She remembered brushing it clean with a small broom before closing the lid for the season. Yet now there were several faint lines pressed into the dirt. They looked almost like small tracks, but they were not clear enough to understand. A sudden gust of wind shook the cabin wall above her. Snow slid from the roof with a heavy thump. The sound made her flinch and pull back from the opening. For a long moment she simply knelt there in the snow, staring down into the hidden woodshed. Nothing moved, no sound came from the chamber below. Finally, she lifted the log she had gathered and lowered the lid once more. She brushed snow over it quickly and stood. The storm had grown fierce now. Wind pushed hard across the clearing, and snow swirled through the air in thick clouds. She hurried back to the cabin and shut the door firmly behind her. Inside, the fire still burned strong. She placed the new logs beside the stove and rubbed warmth back into her cold hands. The cabin felt safe again with the wind roaring outside. Yet the quiet comfort of the room did little to calm her thoughts. Those marks in the dirt floor stayed clear in her mind. Something had been inside the hidden woodshed. Or something had tried to move through it. The woman sat slowly in her chair near the fire. She listened to the storm for a long time. Then, sometime deep in the night, as the wind battered the cabin walls and snow piled high across the valley, a dull sound rose from outside. It came from the direction of the buried woodshed, a slow thump beneath the snow. The sound was dull but clear enough to wake her fully. The woman sat upright in her chair near the stove, her heart beating faster than before. The fire had burned lower during the night, leaving the cabin dim and quiet except for the wind pressing against the walls. For a moment she thought she had imagined it. Winter storms often played tricks with sound. Snow sliding from the roof could echo in strange ways. Branches could scrape against the cabin and seem closer than they really were. But the sound had come from one direction, the buried woodshed. She held still and listened carefully. The wind howled through the trees and rattled the window shutters. Snow tapped softly against the glass. The cabin creaked in slow, familiar ways as the storm moved around it. Nothing else followed. The woman stood and added another log to the stove. The flames rose again, casting warm light across the wooden floor. She waited a moment, staring toward the cabin door as if she might hear the sound again. Silence settled once more. Still, sleep no longer felt possible. She pulled her coat around her shoulders and walked slowly across the room. Her boots waited beside the door, still dusted with snow from earlier that evening. Part of her mind insisted she stay inside. The storm was strong now. Snow had been falling for hours. The woodshed would be buried deep beneath it by morning, but another part of her mind refused to rest. The shifted logs, the marks in the dirt floor, and now the sound. After a moment she pulled on her boots and gloves. The cold would be sharp outside, but she needed to know what was happening near the hidden woodshed. When she opened the door, the wind pushed hard against it. Snow blew into the cabin immediately, swirling across the floor before melting near the stove. She stepped out quickly and pulled the door closed behind her. The yard looked completely different. Snow covered everything in thick layers that reflected the pale moonlight behind the clouds. The cabin roof carried a heavy white load. The trees beyond the clearing swayed slowly in the wind. Her footprints from earlier had vanished. The ground looked untouched. She moved carefully across the yard, pushing through deep snow with each step. The wind stung her face, but she kept going until she reached the spot beside the cabin where the hidden woodshed lay buried. At first she could not see it at all. The snow had covered the wooden lid completely. She began brushing the surface with her gloves, pushing snow aside until the rough edges of the boards appeared. It took several minutes before the outline of the hidden door showed clearly. She paused then, listening. The storm continued around her, filling the forest with restless sound, but nothing seemed to come from beneath the ground. The woman crouched and cleared the rest of the snow away from the lid. Her breath formed clouds in the cold air while she worked. Finally, she gripped the edge of the wood and pulled. The lid lifted slowly. Cold air drifted upward from the small chamber below. She leaned forward and looked down. The underground woodshed appeared much the same as before. Stacks of firewood filled the narrow space along both sides. The floor of packed earth ran between them. The logs at the back still leaned slightly out of place. But the woman noticed something new almost immediately. More marks had appeared in the dirt. They crossed the narrow strip of floor in uneven lines. Some curved slightly. Others ran straight toward the back wall where the logs were stacked highest. The patterns looked clearer now. They were not scratches from falling wood. They were tracks, very small ones. The woman felt a strange mix of relief and confusion. Perhaps it was nothing more than a small animal. A creature might have slipped inside the woodshed when she opened the lid earlier in the winter. The underground space would be dry and protected from snow. Animals often searched for shelter during storms. A mouse or chipmunk could easily squeeze through narrow spaces. Still, the thought did not fully settle her mind. She leaned closer and studied the tracks again. They seemed larger than mouse prints, not by much, but enough to make her pause. Another sound reached her ears then. It came from inside the woodshed, a faint rustle against the stacked firewood. The woman froze. Her eyes searched the dark corners of the small chamber. The moonlight behind the clouds barely reached the bottom, leaving much of the space in shadow. For several seconds nothing moved, then a log near the back shifted slightly. It was not a large movement. Just enough to roll against the one beside it? But the woman saw it clearly. Something was behind the stack. Her breath slowed as she considered what to do. Climbing down into the woodshed during a storm would be difficult. The space was narrow, and the stacks of firewood left little room to move. If an animal had made its home back there, surprising it in such a tight place might cause trouble. The woman lowered the lid halfway, leaving a small opening while she thought. The wind howled through the trees again, shaking loose snow from the branches. The clearing felt colder now, and the storm showed no sign of slowing. Finally, she decided to leave the woodshed alone for the night. If an animal had found shelter there, it would likely stay hidden until the storm passed. Many creatures preferred warmth and quiet during heavy weather. She closed the lid completely and brushed snow across the top once more. Then she returned to the cabin. Inside, the fire warmed her quickly. She removed her coat and gloves and stood near the stove for a long moment, letting the heat chase the chill from her hands. The thought of a small animal living inside the hidden woodshed should have been comforting. It was a simple answer. But the image of those tracks stayed in her mind. They had not looked like mouse prints. They had been longer, almost like tiny narrow feet. She stirred the fire again and added another log. The cabin filled with the familiar crackle of burning wood. As she sat down once more, her thoughts drifted back through the years she had spent in the valley. Winters here had always carried strange moments. Sounds traveled differently under snow. The forest changed in ways that even longtime settlers could not always explain. She remembered stories told in the small town beyond the hills. Old tales passed between neighbors during long evenings near the stove. Most of them spoke about winter habits of animals, foxes searching for shelter, porcupines hiding beneath fallen trees. Sometimes raccoons slipping into barns or sheds to stay warm, but there had been other stories too. Stories about things people heard beneath their cabins during heavy snow, soft scratching under floorboards, strange movements in storage cellars. Most folks laughed those stories away as winter imagination. The valley had a way of making ordinary sounds feel mysterious when the nights grew long. The woman leaned back in her chair and watched the fire. Outside, the storm continued its slow work across the land. Hours passed. If something truly lived inside the woodshed, it might now be trapped beneath deep snow. That thought troubled her more than the mystery itself. She opened the door and stepped into the cold morning air. The storm had finally eased. Snow covered the yard in thick drifts that reached nearly to her knees. The forest looked calm again, as if the long night of wind had never happened. She made her way slowly across the clearing. The hidden woodshed lay buried deeper than before. It took longer this time to brush the snow away from the lid. Her hands moved carefully while the quiet forest watched. When the wooden edge finally appeared, she paused once more. Then she lifted the lid. The underground chamber looked darker than ever, and the stack of firewood at the back had moved again. Several logs now leaned outward, leaving a small gap behind them. A narrow, dark space where something had been pushing from within the woodshed itself. The woman stared into the narrow gap behind the stacked firewood, her hands gripping the edge of the wooden opening. The snow around her boots was still and quiet, but the dark space beneath the ground seemed to hold its own breath. The logs had clearly been pushed outward. That much she could no longer deny. When she built the hidden woodshed beneath the cabin, she stacked every piece carefully. Each row had been tight and balanced so the wood would stay dry and easy to reach all winter. The back wall of the shed had been packed solid with logs, leaving no empty space at all. Now several pieces leaned forward and a hollow pocket had formed behind them. Something had been moving back there. She watched the opening for a long moment, expecting the logs to shift again. Nothing moved. Cold air slipped out of the underground space and brushed against her face. The scent of dry firewood rose with it, mixed with the smell of damp earth. The woman leaned closer and listened. At first she heard only the soft whisper of wind through the trees behind the cabin. The storm had passed, leaving the valley covered in deep snow and pale morning light. Then she heard it again, a faint rustle. It came from behind the leaning stack. Not loud, not sudden, just a slow movement against wood. Her heart beat faster. The woman stepped back from the opening for a moment, thinking carefully. Climbing down there without knowing what waited behind the stack could be dangerous. The woodshed was narrow and deep, with just enough room for a person to stand between the piles of firewood. If an animal had burrowed its way into the back wall somehow, it might be frightened or trapped. And frightened animals could react in strange ways. She glanced toward the cabin. Smoke drifted gently from the chimney and the warm glow of the fire waited inside. For a second she considered closing the lid and leaving the woodshed alone for a while longer. But the thought did not sit well with her. The hidden woodshed was the reason she would stay warm through the winter. It held the dry firewood she depended on every single day. If something had broken into that space or damaged the stacked logs, the problem would only grow worse if she ignored it. She brushed more snow away from the edges of the opening and lowered herself carefully through the wooden door. Her boots landed on the packed dirt floor with a soft thud. Inside the underground woodshed the air felt colder but still dry. The wooden walls held firm against the earth outside. The narrow space smelled strongly of split pine and oak. Light from the opening above her head reached down just enough to see the stacks. The leaning logs at the back looked even more disturbed from this angle. She stepped forward slowly. Each movement echoed softly in the confined space. The stacked firewood formed tall rows on either side of her shoulders, leaving only a narrow path down the middle. When she reached the back, she crouched and examined the logs more closely. The tracks in the dirt floor were clearer now. They crossed the ground in small, curved patterns, moving from the center of the woodshed toward the back wall where the gap had formed. They were not mouse tracks. They were wider, still small, but shaped differently. The woman touched one of the leaning logs and gently pulled it aside. Another log behind it rolled forward. Then another. Soon a small opening appeared between the stacked pieces, revealing the dark space behind them. Cold air drifted out from the gap. It carried a faint, earthy smell that did not belong inside the dry woodshed. The woman leaned closer and tried to see what lay beyond the woodpile. At first she saw only darkness. Then her eyes adjusted slightly. Behind the stack of firewood was the back wall of the shed, just as she had built it months earlier. Thick boards held the packed soil outside in place. But one of those boards had shifted. Not broken, shifted. A narrow space had opened between two pieces of timber near the ground. It was only a few inches wide, but the dirt around it looked loose, as if something had been digging from the other side. The woman felt a chill move through her chest. The hidden woodshed had been meant to keep moisture and snow away from the firewood. But now it looked as though something from outside had found the dry warmth beneath the cabin and decided to push its way in. She leaned closer to the small opening in the wall. The loose soil around it showed faint scratch marks. Tiny pieces of dirt had fallen onto the floor, forming a small pile beside the wood stack. Whatever had made the tracks had come through that gap, and it might still be nearby. Just then the logs beside her shifted again. A soft scrape came from the dark space behind the stack. The woman pulled back quickly, her shoulder brushing against the wood piles beside her. For a moment nothing else happened. The underground woodshed felt very quiet. Even the wind outside seemed distant. She stood still and listened. Another small sound came from the gap, a faint movement in the dirt. Then a tiny clump of soil dropped through the opening and landed on the floor. The woman slowly reached for the nearest log and held it in both hands. It was not meant as a weapon, only something solid to steady herself if the creature suddenly rushed forward. Her mind ran through possibilities. A fox might dig through loose soil during winter. A raccoon might search for warmth. Even a porcupine could burrow beneath a structure if the ground allowed it. But the opening looked smaller than most burrows she had seen before. Whatever had made it was not large. Still, it had been strong enough to move several stacked logs. The woman took a slow step backward toward the center of the woodshed. She did not want to corner whatever creature might be hiding behind the woodpile. The gap in the wall remained still. Snow light from the open lid above touched the floor in a pale square. Another quiet rustle came from the hole. This time the movement sounded closer. The woman felt her grip tighten on the log she held. A small piece of soil fell away from the opening. Then another. Something pressed gently against the loose dirt from the other side. The stacked firewood beside the gap shifted slightly again. One of the leaning logs rolled forward and settled against her boot. The underground woodshed suddenly felt smaller than before. The woman took another step back, giving the opening more space. For several seconds nothing moved. Then the soil at the gap crumbled a little more. A narrow shape pushed through the loose earth, not fully, just enough to disturb the dirt and widen the small hole. The woman held her breath. Her mind raced with questions. Had the animal been digging all night during the storm? Had it been trapped beneath the snow outside and found the woodshed by chance? Or had it been searching for warmth from the start? Another soft scrape came from the opening. More dirt slipped away. The hole widened slowly. Behind her the firewood stacks creaked quietly as the underground air shifted. The woman could hear her own heartbeat now, steady but strong. She glanced once toward the ladder space beneath the open lid above her. Climbing out would be easy if she needed to. But part of her did not want to leave yet. The mystery that had followed her for days was finally beginning to show itself. Another small movement came from the hole. The dirt shifted again. Something behind the wall was pushing forward with careful effort. The woman stepped back once more until she stood near the center of the woodshed. Light from above reached the floor beside her boots while the back wall remained in shadow. The small hole widened a little more, then the movement stopped. Silence filled the underground space. The woman waited, every sense focused on the dark gap behind the woodpile. Whatever had been digging had nearly broken through. And in the quiet stillness of the hidden woodshed beneath the cabin, it felt as though the next moment would finally reveal what had been living just beyond the wall all winter. The woman stood very still in the center of the hidden woodshed, the log held loosely in her hands. The small hole in the back wall had grown wider, and loose soil continued to crumble softly onto the dirt floor. The quiet inside the underground space felt heavy, as if the woodshed itself was waiting. Then the movement came again. The soil shifted once more, and something small pushed gently through the gap. At first she saw only a dark shape covered in dirt. It moved slowly, carefully, as if testing the air on the other side of the wall. The creature paused halfway through the opening, and the woman realized it was much smaller than she had imagined. A tiny nose appeared first, then a narrow head. The woman blinked in surprise. It was not a fox, not a raccoon, not anything large or threatening. It was a small woodland animal, no bigger than her hand, with soft gray fur dusted in soil. Its whiskers twitched as it looked around the woodshed with bright, curious eyes. The woman slowly lowered the log in her hands. A long moment passed as the two simply looked at each other. The little creature seemed just as surprised to see her as she was to see it. It remained half inside the hole, half inside the woodshed, its tiny paws resting on the dirt floor where the tracks had been made. The woman let out a quiet breath she had been holding for what felt like hours. So that was the mystery. The tracks in the dirt, the rustling sounds, the shifting logs. This tiny winter guest had been trying to reach the dry space beneath the cabin. She crouched down slowly, careful not to startle it. The small animal sniffed the air again, its whiskers moving rapidly. It looked around at the stacks of dry firewood and the wooden walls of the hidden woodshed. To a creature searching for shelter in deep winter, this place must have seemed perfect, dry, protected, warm compared to the frozen forest outside. The woman could not help but smile slightly. All the tension of the past few days began to loosen in her chest. The little creature finally pushed the rest of its body through the hole and stepped onto the dirt floor. Its fur was thick for the winter season, and its small tail flicked lightly behind it. It walked a few steps forward, sniffing the ground where the firewood stacks leaned. The woman stayed still, watching quietly. She realized the animal had likely begun digging during the storm, when the snow outside had grown too deep and the ground beneath the cabin still held some warmth. The loose soil behind the woodshed wall had given it a place to start. And once it smelled the dry wood and shelter inside, it had kept digging. The creature moved slowly along the edge of the stacked logs, leaving new tracks beside the old ones. For the first time since the strange sounds began, the woodshed felt calm again. The mystery was no longer frightening. It was simply part of winter life in the valley. The woman glanced at the small hole in the wall. It would need repairing soon to keep the woodshed strong and dry, but for the moment it was harmless. She shifted slightly on her feet, and the animal paused. For a second it looked up at her again. Its bright eyes reflected the pale light from the open lid above. Then, as quietly as it had arrived, it turned and slipped back toward the hole in the wall. Its small body disappeared through the opening into the loose soil beyond. Only the faint movement of dirt showed where it had gone. The woman remained crouched there for a moment longer, listening. No more rustling came from the other side. Just silence. Eventually she stood and walked toward the ladder beneath the woodshed door. The square of daylight above looked brighter now, and cold winter air drifted down into the underground space. She climbed out and stepped back onto the snowy ground. The valley looked peaceful again. The storm had passed completely, leaving the forest quiet and shining under fresh snow. Sunlight broke through the clouds and touched the tops of the pine trees. The woman brushed the snow from her coat and looked back down at the open woodshed. The hidden woodshed had done exactly what she built it for. It had protected her firewood through storms and freezing nights. The stacks inside were still dry and ready for the long winter ahead. Even the unexpected visitor had not harmed anything. She gathered several logs from the opening and set them beside the lid. Before closing it, she paused and looked down one last time. The dirt floor still showed the tiny tracks crossing the narrow space between the firewood stacks. They were no longer mysterious now, just the quiet marks of a small creature trying to survive the cold. The woman replaced the leaning logs carefully, stacking them back into place the way she had done in autumn. She left a little space near the back wall where the hole remained, not large enough to cause trouble, but enough that the creature would not feel trapped if it returned. After that, she closed the heavy wooden lid and brushed snow across it once again. From the outside, the hidden woodshed disappeared beneath the white ground just as before. No one passing through the valley would ever know it was there. She carried the firewood back to the cabin and stepped inside. The warmth of the stove greeted her immediately. She placed the new logs beside the hearth and added one to the fire. Flames rose with a steady crackle, filling the room with a comforting glow. Outside, the quiet winter forest stretched across the valley. Inside, the small cabin felt warm and safe. The woman sat in her chair near the fire and looked toward the window where sunlight now touched the snow. The strange sounds, the shifting logs, and the restless nights suddenly felt like a distant worry. In their place was a simple understanding. Winter brought many challenges to the valley. Heavy snow, cold winds, long quiet nights. But it also reminded her that she was not the only living thing trying to make it through the season. The forest was full of small lives searching for warmth and shelter. Some found it in hollow trees, some beneath rocks and fallen branches. And one small creature had nearly chosen her hidden woodshed beneath the cabin. The thought made her smile again. Later that afternoon, she stepped outside once more to check the snow around the yard. The clearing looked bright under the winter sun, and the tracks of birds and squirrels crossed the surface of the drifts. Near the cabin wall, she noticed something small, tiny footprints in the snow. They led away from the spot where the woodshed lay buried and disappeared toward the line of trees at the edge of the forest. The little visitor had found its way back outside. The woman watched those tracks for a moment before turning back toward the cabin. Her hidden woodshed would keep her firewood dry all winter, just as she had planned. The careful work she did in autumn had protected her home from the cold months ahead. And the mystery that had stirred the quiet valley had turned out to be something gentle after all. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the snowy hills and the fire burned steadily in the stove, the cabin felt warmer than it had in days. The woman sat beside the hearth with a blanket across her knees and listened to the calm sounds of the forest settling for the night. The hidden woodshed rested beneath the snow outside. The firewood inside waited for the long winter days ahead. And somewhere in the woods beyond the clearing, a small gray creature had found its own safe place to rest. The valley grew quiet again, wrapped in snow and soft light, while the woman and her cabin stood ready to welcome the rest of the winter together.